you need to be in room 106 where Scott Talley is going to begin this 8-week parenting class. And this is, if you got kids, birth all the way through high school. It's even good if you're a grandparent and find yourself in a parenting role with grandkids. You need to be there in room 106. Over in the community center, Mislav is going to come and present what's going on in his ministry in Zagreb. And so we want you, the rest of you, to be over there and join us to listen to what's happening in there and get some exciting news about that. Church, I want to tell you that next week, I'm going to begin a series called Fresh Water. It's a study of baptism. And for a few weeks, I'm going to preach about baptism and give some teaching concerned to that. And I asked for a couple of things. The first is I want you to ask questions. If there are questions that you have about baptism, something that you want answered about baptism, that will help me in my preparations to know how to best speak to this. And so if you want to look at the communication card that you have, if you've got a question about baptism, you're welcome to write it there on the communication card. There's also those gray cards in the pew rack in front of you. You can take it and fill that out there as well. And later on the service, when the offering plate goes by, you can put it in there and that'll get to me. My email address is listed in our newsletter if you want to email me questions or if you just want to call the office and have a question about that, and you can give me your question that way as well. But I would invite your questions. I would invite what you want to know about. And also, that's the first thing. The second thing, I ask for you to pray over these messages. Pray that I speak truth in God's way. And the truth of the matter is I don't get excited about preaching about baptism. I get excited about preaching the gospel. And so pray that in this that the gospel is proclaimed and told. And with that, let's go to God in prayer right now. Father, I pray that your will would constantly be done among us because, God, we are imperfect people and we are broken people. Some of us come here today feeling on the outside, feeling hopeless. Some of us come today, God, and we have not even been able to see outside of ourselves. We are affected by selfishness and selfish desires. Lord, we come to you, and frankly, we're a mess. But we present ourselves to you before a perfect and holy God once again to worship you and to trust that you will set us right. So, Lord, for that reason, for that purpose, would you pour through me a gift of preaching today? Would you open our hearts again to your word and to the wonder of your love? God, I pray that today we would be affected and we would be changed because we have encountered Jesus yet again. In the name of Christ, we pray these things. Amen. My father's a physician. Years ago, I think I was in college when this happened. I remember seeing my dad. He was, and he had this look of confusion or frustration is the word. He was frustrated. He was on call that weekend, and he just turned around and he told me the story that had happened to him. He had just hung up the phone, and he reported to me about the events. Earlier that day, that morning, he had received a phone call from someone who began to explain his symptoms and lay out what was going on. My dad was quick to tell him, you need to hang up the phone right now and call 911. You are having a heart attack. And when Dad said those words, the man responded back and said, well, I've got a family reunion today that I'm in charge of. And I'm going to, once I get this taken care of, then I'll call the ambulance. I'll go in and get looked at. And Dad said, look, I can't make you do anything, but I'm telling you, you could die. The man thanked him for his time and hung up the phone call, the phone. 4 or 5 hours later, the phone rang again, and it was, and Dad picked it up, and it was the wife of the man who had called earlier. And she simply said, I want to thank you for trying. But 40 minutes after after he called, he collapsed and died. And I appreciate what you tried to do for us, but he wouldn't listen. And it occurs to me that heart issues cannot be taken lightly. If there's a heart issue, it's a serious matter. There are some times when I preach sermons that I think you need to hear. Today I'm preaching a sermon that I think I need to hear, because it's a sermon that has to do with the very heart of the gospel. And it's a text that's found right in the center, right in the heart of the Gospel of Luke. It's a story that happens in Luke chapter 15. And I'll start and kind of set up what's happening in this story. Jesus is eating dinner, as he is often found to be doing in the Gospel of Luke. And there's different groups of people in the room. There's Jesus and his disciples. And then there's the sinners and tax collectors. And Jesus is fellowshipping with them. And apparently they're having a good time and a good conversation. And Jesus is visiting and teaching them. But then there's another group that's there that day. There's the Pharisees and teachers of the law. And they don't like what's going on here. And they're working their jaws around. They're getting more and more frustrated as they go. And they point out and they can't believe that Jesus would fellowship with these sinners and tax collectors. To them, it's not just because people are making bad moral decisions. These sinners and tax collectors are the problem. They're the root of why the history of Israel has gone off the rails. They're the reason to blame for why it is that their nation is occupied by the Romans at this moment. And they're working their jaws around thinking, if these people would just submit themselves to the righteousness of God and to the law of Moses, that God would bless us and take away all of this oppression around us and give us our land back. And they're frustrated. Why? How in the world could Jesus call himself a teacher of God and posture like a righteous man and fellowship with the unrighteous like this? And these are the words that Luke gives us in verses 1 and 2 of Luke chapter 15. He says, now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus, but the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, this man welcomes sinners and eats with them. Don't you know that sinners are supposed to be concealed and condemned, not welcomed? Why are you coddling these people, Jesus? And so in response, Jesus tells a series of stories. The first story is a story about a shepherd who had 100 sheep, and one of those sheep wanders off, and that shepherd looks and looks and looks for that one sheep, and he brings them back, and they have a party, and they rejoice for that sheep that was found and returned. And the next story is the story of a woman who had 10 coins, but she loses one coin, and she sweeps through the house and she searches until she finds that coin. And when she gets that coin back, she calls up and they have a party to celebrate finding that coin. And he tells those two stories as a setup to this third story. It's a story about a man that has two sons. So I want to look at this story and spend our time walking through this story today. Luke chapter 15, starting verse 11. So the first couple of verses says, Jesus continued, there was a man who had two sons. The younger said to his father, Father, give me my share of the estate. So he divided his property between them. The son in this story goes up to the father and says, I want to play a game. I want to do something right now. I want us to go through a mental exercise, and I want us to play the game, and the game is this: you're dead. You're dead, you've stopped breathing, and everything that I'm going to get when you die, I want you to give it to me right now, because let's be honest about where we are in our relationship. It's over. There's nothing between us anymore, and all we're doing is playing for time. The very breath in your lungs is getting between me and where I want to be. So let's just speed things up. Let's just cut out the middleman and wait instead of waiting for the years it takes until you die. Why don't we just play this game right now? You cut me a check. You give me my share of the inheritance, and this relationship is over. You'll be dead to me, and I'll be dead to you. Now, all of a sudden, this is different than sheep, right? A dumb sheep that just wanders off because that's what sheep do, or the coin that's just an object that gets dropped someplace. It didn't do anything malicious. This is malicious. This is rebellious. This is insubordinate. This is shameful. This is the kind of thing that ruins a family. The younger son says to his father, I want you dead. Give me my share of the estate. And the text itself really says, and the father divided his life between the two sons. He didn't just give him his possession. He gave him his life. This is all I have to give you. And so armed with that, the son makes that connection that so many of us do, that receiving a blessing gives us license to go and do what we want to do. And so he takes that money and he runs. The story continues in verse 13. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had. He set off for a distant country. And there he squandered his wealth in wild living. After he spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country. And he began to be in need. And so he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country who sent him to his field to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. So he went out, going to a land that he thought would promise abundance. And he thought, it'll never dry up, it'll never end. And so just like the oil workers running out to Odessa, he made all the money and it was gone. And now he had payments that he couldn't afford. He had lots of things that he couldn't do. And he was in trouble. And that land that looked so good and looked so fertile was really, in fact, a land of famine. And he was in need. And when the cash ran out, so did the entourage. And so did his friends. No one would text him back. No one would return the phone calls. And he found out that he was on his own. And so he took the only job that was available to him. He took what was there and he went into a field to feed the pigs. Now remember to whom Jesus is speaking. He's speaking to Jewish people, and this is the lowest rung that you can get on the ladder. This is rock bottom. The Jews would have believed that a pig was unclean, disgusting, and you wouldn't be found around them. Just by being in their presence, it would soil your soul. But there he was, not only tending to the pigs, but wishing he could eat what the pigs were eating. See, this is what sin does. Just to be honest and real with you, sin postures itself as mature. It postures itself as freedom, as grown up. It masquerades as a mark of being an adult. And so we begin to play this game with sin, and we look and we go, well, sophisticated people have affairs. Sophisticated people experiment with their sexuality. That's part of becoming a mature person. Free people numb their minds on drugs and alcohol. They're the real woke ones out there. It's the people who are mature that find themselves getting and acquiring all the material blessings that they can. Because that's what being a grown-up feels like. A grown-up is someone who gets more than they need and acquires and gets and maintains so much more than they need. Doesn't that feel very adult? And sin postures itself as maturity and freedom, But the reality is sin leads us into the mud pit. It leads us and drags us in there with the hogs. And sin, when it runs its course, is far from glamorous. It leaves us spiritually and often materially impoverished and destitute. And sin can do a number on our lives. And many of us have felt the same way and have felt the effect of being in that pigsty, just along with that younger brother. Well, it's in his rock bottom time that the younger brother begins to come back to his senses, and he begins to dream of another life, a life that he left a long time ago. And these are the words that Luke gives us. He says, when he came to his senses, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have food to spare? And here I am, starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. So he got up and he went to his father. The son turned and he set his path to go back to his homeland, away from the famine country, with the mud on his coat, with the smell of pigs on his body, with the pig manure between his toes. He walked back, rehearsing the speech every step of the way. Father, I have sinned against heaven, and I've sinned against you. I am not worthy to be called your son. Just make me like one of your hired hands. Father, I've sinned against heaven. I've sinned against you. He knows that he's traded in his sonship, and he's cashed in his relationship with his father. So he's not going to hold on to that. He just has a hope that his dad will take him back, not as a son, but as a servant, because he knows that his dad never let anyone starve. And with every step of the way, he goes not with the hope of being a son, but only the hope of being a servant. Father, I've sinned against heaven. I've sinned against you. I'm no longer worthy of being called your son. Make me like one of your hired hands. And then the moment comes. And we begin to get this picture that Luke gives us. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with, and here's where we fill in the blank. Oh, our assumptions of God come out at this moment, don't they? Because we know what it would be like. Some of us would answer this, and he saw him, and he was filled with anger. He was filled with righteous indignation. He was filled with frustration. He was filled with a moral superiority. He was filled with, I told you so. He was filled with reservation. But that's not the story. But while he was still a long way off, Luke tells us, go ahead and advance it. The father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. Stained with the mud, filled with the smell of the pigs, with the manure still on that son's feet, he didn't make that son go get ritually pure before he comes. He embraced him and he kissed him. And here in this moment, we see the truth and the reality. And we get to the heart of the matter. And the heart of the matter is this: while the son was in that far off land, wasting his father's possessions, the father was not idly sitting by. The father had also been working on a plan to restore and redeem and to bring his son back into his home. And when the son came to him without hope and hopeless, the father held on to hope. And the father held on to his desire not to have an employee, but he wanted his boy back. So the picture of the Father and the Son rings out. And it turns out that this is a moment that takes our breath away. And when we understand and come face to face with the compassion of God, it's a moment that makes us pause and we wonder, oh, is this what love really is like? But that son wasn't going to be deterred. He had prepared a speech, and he was going to get the words out. While he was still a long way off, his father saw him, was filled with compassion. He ran to the son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son's not going to be deterred. The son said to him, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son." But it turns out that the father had also been rehearsing a speech. And the father had also been rehearsing a plan. And the father waits for this moment to spring his trap on the son, to ambush his son, not with judgment, but with mercy like we can't even imagine. But the father said to his servants, "Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and let's celebrate, for this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." So they began to celebrate. The father's been busy. The father hasn't been idly sitting by. He's been getting everything ready just for this moment. And he had been rehearsing his speech. Quick, get a robe, get the ring, get the sandals, bring it to this son, put it around him. He's back, and you take that fattened calf and kill it. And we're going to have a feast, and the party is going to begin right now. Now, it's also important for us to understand, it's not the fattest calf. He didn't just go out there to the field and go, well, that one looks good. This was a specially prepared animal. And in their culture, a fattened calf was an animal that you would prepare for a special occasion, a special party that was going to come up, and you would hand feed that animal apart from the other animals. This was a specially prepared animal. The father had been waiting for this moment. He had been doing everything in preparation for this time. He had everything ready. All he needed was his son to come home. And before his son could finish his speech, the father enacted his plan. Now, he didn't have to do this, did he? I mean, I think that for most of us, the story would have been just fine if the father had simply just maybe patted his son on the back and said, "Well, glad you're back, boy." That would have been enough. That would have been enough mercy right there. That would have been good, but it wasn't good enough for God. Because the God that we serve is the God who is throwing a party to welcome his lost home. And God's kingdom, God's church, is a celebration of his mercy and compassion, of his adoption of his sons and daughters back to him. So it is that maybe you're here this morning and you've been in the pigsty and you came this morning, somebody dragged you to church this morning. What you need to understand is that God is running toward you. Not to condemn you, not to convict you, not to hang you out to dry, not to get real with Dr. Phil. He's coming to love you and invite you into the party that he's prepared. And the story could end here. And if we ended the story here, it would be a great ending, but this isn't the reason why Jesus told this story. Because he's not talking to the sinners and tax collectors in the room. He's talking to the religious experts, the one who have it all together. He's talking to good church people. And so Jesus continues the story. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. And when he came near the house, he heard music and dancing, so he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. "Your brother has come," he replied, "and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back, safe and sound." So the older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him, but he answered his father, "Look, all of these years I've been slaving for you, and I never disobeyed your orders, yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours who squandered your property with prostitutes comes home, you killed a fattened calf for him." "My son," said the father, "you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." Now, the older brother had a point, didn't he? See, the older brother had been obeying his father's orders, which means his older brother had been hand-feeding a calf, had been polishing a ring and making sure the robe was set out and the sandals beside there. And the whole time, the older brother is thinking, my party's going to be so great. My party's going to be so good. They're going to be talking about my party for years. And then the surprise moment comes along, and it's not your party. It's his party. What? After everything he did, after all the things that he put you, you're throwing a party for him. Why would you do that? See, God is extravagant in his love, and I think there's a moment in this story where that younger brother would have looked at this feast, and as he was adorned with the robe and had the sandals and the ring put on him, as he's adopted back in the sonship, and as the party begins and the calf is slaughtered and the meat and the Texas barbecue is being eaten, he would have thought, wow, all this is really for me? This must be what love is. And the older brother has been invited to partner with the father in order to throw a party for that son so that son could begin to realize, oh, this is what love looks like. Now, Crestview, most of us in this room, we're the older brother. Most of us in this room are now some of us, we were the younger brother, but guess what? We got old. And now we're the older brother, and God has the same purpose and the same mission for you. Did you know that God didn't just save you so that you could go to heaven? He saved you so that you could partner with him to throw a party so that this world can look and say, wow, all this is for me. This must be what love is like. And that's what we are about. And to this mission, God asks us to give our time, our talent, and yes, our treasure. Now, you'll notice today as you came in our pews, we have our stewardship cards that we laid out there. And if you're a member of Crestview, we want you to participate in our stewardship process. We want you to go through an exercise that is helping you commit towards giving your resources to the work of the Lord over this next year. And as a member of Crestview, we're calling you to prioritize your giving and stewardship. We believe that this doesn't happen by accident. It doesn't just happen when you feel like it. That stewardship is something that you prioritize and you are intentional about doing. And so as we begin 2017, we're going through a time as a church to be able to pray over these things and do this. Now, if you're not one of our members, then you're welcome to take a card and look at this, but you're not required and not expected to go through this. And so we want you to be a priority giver. We want you to be a percentage giver. Think about what your percentage of your income is that you're willing to give to the Lord. My family and I, we believe that 10% is a minimum of where we begin to start with our giving. And so start there, but pick a percentage. It might not be 10, it might be lower, it might be higher. But pick a percentage and stick with that. So if your income during the year goes up, stick with your percentage. If it goes down, stick with your percentage. Be a priority percentage giver. And we ask you all to participate in this process. Take some time and look at this. This is not an exercise that we're doing for the church. We do ask that you turn these in by July. That would be really helpful. January 29th. January 29th, so just a few weeks away. But this isn't an exercise for the church. We won't be going and inventorying your commitment. We don't do that. But this is for you. This is for you to make a time where you get to intentionally sit down and talk with your family, or if you're single, be able to sit down and look at what your income is going to be and make a priority commitment to being a generous giver. So this is about you and doing that. Because we have been given a calling, and that calling is to participate with God in throwing a party so that others, the hopeless, the lost, the impoverished, those who are beat down with sin and oppression of all different forms, those who maybe have never had words of affirmation spoken over them, those who don't know how much they are loved, maybe they can begin to see the love that our Father has for them. In October of this last year, a group from Crestview went to Baton Rouge to help out with families who had lost everything because of the flooding. We sent them, we put resources from the church. The elders sent $5,000 to buy gift cards so that people could have and get some of their possessions and get some things that they needed. But we had the groups work, and they split up into different teams in their work, and Mike Coates shared a story about his group. They worked for a few days in this house, and they were hanging drywall, and they were getting this constructed, and they were getting this put together. And as the time ended and they were getting ready to leave, they went and they were loading everything up, and the man and the son that they had been working with, they had a moment where the man, his eyes just filled with tears. And you know what those tears were saying? Wow. All this for me? This must be what love looks like. A couple of months ago, Crestview saved Christmas. We've been involved in the Waco Toy Drive, in the Mission Waco Toy Drive for several years. But this last year, there was a special need. The woman who led and directed the drive, she's received some terrible health news, and she was in a terrible crisis with her health, and continue to pray for her. But because of her health, she couldn't go on. She couldn't do what she had always done. And in that gap and in that void of leadership, Cheryl Stevenson and Donna Smith from our church rose up, and they took the reins of this, and they led in such a special way, and they worked and they worked and they worked, and they used the resources of our office and our staff. Cheryl just made runs everywhere buying all kinds of things. We not only filled up our stage with bicycles and toys, you remember that, but we also stored toys from, that you can't even imagine how many spaces we had with toys around here. And we transported all those over to the Mission Waco store. One of our own members, Carrie Malone, went, and she was kind of the one that made that look like a real store and made it look like a real special thing. And then members from our church went, and they worked to set it up. They worked to help the families come through. We worked so much on that. You know why we did that? You know why we did that? Because there were families that were living in poverty in this, and they didn't have an answer for how they were going to be able to have their kids have Christmas like all the other kids have Christmas. But then there was that moment where they walked into that Waco toy store that we had set up, and they looked around, and you know what they did at that moment? They said, wow, all this for me. This must be what love looks like. The church is never more the church than when we are showing the love of God to a world that doesn't even believe it's possible. That's the mission of the church. And we ask for you to join in this mission and join with this calling. This story leaves on an open note. You pick your own ending to this story, because as the story ends, the older brother is there in the field and the party's going on in the house. What's he going to do? Is he going to stand outside with his own self-righteousness and his own unmet expectations? Or is he going to take up the cause and the purpose that the Father had for him the whole time and enter in and enjoy the party that's been prepared all along? Crestview, you get to finish the story. And you and I get to finish the way it goes with how we respond. We're going to have an invitation time now. If there's anything that you need to have taken care of, if there's a need on your heart that you want the prayers of this church about, if you need to know how it is that you can come back to the Father and receive that welcome that the Lord wants to give you, then I invite you to come and talk to me. Our elders and their wives will be available to pray. Our ministers will be available as well. But however we can help, let's do it right now as we stand and sing together.
Lord, you are more precious.